this is still following along those traditional lines of city-states vying with each other to be the most loved child in the succession drama that is our national discourse. Hello and welcome to another episode of the BetaKit Podcast, where we talk about Canadian tech and tech from a Canadian perspective. Rob, let's talk about tech events in Canada. Rob, why are we talking about tech events in Canada this week?
Well, Douglas, BetaKit's broken. I'm telling you, by the way.
Yeah,
BetaKit's broken multiple stories in the past few months that seem to indicate the state of events in Canadian tech are changing as much as the venture market is.
Yeah. Okay, that's very true. Let's talk about what the state of that is. So we've got events are struggling. Traction, Vancouver event is on pause. CIX, breaking maybe a little bit of news here, might not be long for this world. We've got a bunch of conversations with government funding and support of tech, always on, can be trusted. And we've got that familiar conversation about locally grown versus branch plant innovation, in this case from the event standpoint. And then we have the always fun conversation about the relationship between tech and the media. Maybe a great time to introduce Josh Scott, reporter for BetaKit, who's going to be joining us to, if not lead that conversation, participate as a member of the media. We're just podcasters. He's media. Did I miss anything on this list? This is probably the most notes we've ever taken for a podcast before. It's gonna be a little in the weeds, folks.
That is correct. New line, Douglas. I don't think so. I think given that it's the beginning of June and what's been going on lately, I think everything begins and ends with collision.
Oh, you said the word. I think we had a podcast before where, what was it? Innovation policy was our drinking word. Collision might be our drinking word for this episode. Collision, if you don't know, it's a North American tech event that has been taking place in Toronto since 2019. It's happening in a few weeks from this recording, June 26th, which happens to also be the City of Toronto's mayoral election. We might get into that. Josh is going to break down a bunch of the stories that I'm about to reference in detail, but just to kind of set the stage for everyone.
This is where you get popcorn, because this is going to be a thing, and you want to
lean in
watch.
Because we want to have, we had been talking for a while. Let's set this up in the meta context about, hey, there's an opportunity to talk about tech events across Canada. It's event season. Startup Fest is coming up. There are Elevate's coming up, SAS North. It's at the beginning of that kind of season events. I think C2 just happened in Montreal. We've had people from those events on before, interesting conversations, opportunity for a check-in. How do we frame this? And then a whole bunch of stuff happened over the last 2 months, and we now feel like a cultural obligation to talk through.
Kind of collided, really.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Sorry,
okay.
That was free.
If it's a pun, does it count in the drinking game? Okay. So I'm going to run through a little bit of a state of play of the last 2 months so that we're all on the same page. And then we're actually going to pick the bones of this conversation and see where we end up, because I promise you, there are very interesting things in this long-winded breakdown, but I'm going to do it as fast as I possibly goddamn can. Okay. So this is technically Collision's last guaranteed year in Toronto and perhaps Canada. In April, BetaKit got a tip that it looked like Collision, specifically Collision's CEO, Collision Web Summit. Collision is owned by Web Summit. You're probably familiar with Web Summit around the world. Patty Cosgrave was communicating privately that the event was coming back to Toronto. A lot of things happened from April to mid-May, but in mid-May, BetaKit ran a 4,000-word story noting several things. One, despite Cosgrave's statements privately, no renewed agreement had been signed with the city. Collision and Toronto were looking for a renewed 3-year deal, but a 1-year bridge deal was way more likely because our city is broke and we have no mayor. Our story also had some details on the economic impact of Collision and some full-throated vocal support from municipal leaders, including former Toronto Mayor John Tory, which, Josh, I think we were talking about this before, is one of the first times Mayor Tory has made a public statement since leaving office. That story also included detailed numbers about how much government subsidy at the, let's say, broadly municipal level Collision has received in years past to come here, and how much Collision was looking to stay for another 3 years, which the high level north of about 40 million all in terms of subsidies over the 3 years, putting it on par with, as it's been reported, the kind of renewal deal to keep Web Summit in Lisbon. Our story also had several egregious statements made by Web Summit CEO Paddy Cosgrave to BetaKit as we reported this story. So all of that kicked off what was an epic shitstorm. Shortly after, you had Phil Tellio, CEO of Startup Fest, the wonderful Montreal tech event that we're going to be at, actually podcasting live for. We should talk about that soon. He penned an op-ed in the Globe and Mail effectively saying, good riddance to Collision and your $40 million ask. Government should support local events. Collision has been a bad spouse. He didn't say bad spouse to whom, but I think it's like the collective spousery. We have a group of Vancouver individuals publicly opining that, hey, if Collision is not going to stay in Toronto, wouldn't it look very nice in Vancouver? And then, by the way, BetaKit broke a story. Again, I'm just going to be pointing at Josh a lot, and then he's going to be breaking it down in detail. BetaKit broke a story indicating that those same individuals are part of a group actively exploring behind the scenes a formal pitch to Collision to have them come to Vancouver. Meanwhile, BetaKit also broke another story noting that local event company Q Business Media, they make the events SAS North, Tech Exit, others that I'm failing to remember right now, are launching their own Vancouver tech event for next year, Innovate West. And that announcement, that announcement after we ran the story, was more or less prompted in response to the chatter around Collision coming to Vancouver. And then just this week, oh my friggin' God, noted other tech publication, The Logic, their editor-in-chief, David Scott, ran an op-ed noting that they had been barred from attending Collision this year. It seemed ostensibly because they were planning to run their own private subscriber-only events in Toronto before Collision was set to start, but kind of in the same period. Now, Collision came out and pretty full-throatedly publicly denied that was the case, that this was just essentially the Logic piggybacking Collision, and they weren't going to allow speakers, moderators from the Logic who were hosting their own events to then moderate at Collision. A bunch of stuff happened that we'll get to, trust me. And then yesterday, as we were prepping for this podcast, Paddy Cosgrave tweeted that everyone at the Logic is fully welcome to attend and be accredited, and he cordially invited the Logic, BetaKit, and Startup Fest to speak on center stage at Collision about their conferences, events, media, and Canadian tech. I, of course, was first to respond saying, who's moderating? And then screw it, I'm in, which was, I don't know. You didn't really give me a lot of advice on the podcast prep call while I was tweeting that. But Rob, okay. That's been our experience for the last 2 months. Help us parse what that is and where it's going.
You know, you have to hear it in this sort of novelized format to sort of really contextualize all the thing. I mean,
now in video,
the story alone, the BetaKit story alone, the first story that broke was like very long. So it took a lot of thought.
Solemn nod from Josh Scott.
Certainly the longest thing piece of journalism I've produced today.
I think one of the longest things that BetaKit has ever published.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of meat in there. And I know we're going to talk about that. You know, it's one of those things where, I mean, I know we're going to get into it, but if you recall, even when we first were bidding for Collision, we sent a delegation out to Toronto, Canada, Toronto, sent a delegation out to lobby for that. So there was a lot of humans going over there to lobby, see what it was like, see if it made sense. And even this time around, I was at Web Summit this year, and there's a lot of Toronto delegates or Toronto-like delegates thinking about.
They never left. They're still delegating.
They're still stuck. Well, Lisbon's not exactly terrible. And so I think the hard thing to measure is, and we can talk about this more, but what truly is the economic impact? That's a number that, you know, you've mentioned this in your story, which is the city was on the hook for a lot of the bill, but is there an economic impact beyond the city and beyond the province? It's worth talking about.
Is that your biggest takeaway? Is that your first reaction? Because I know that
Yeah.
Obviously the public response, we'll get to Phil's op-ed a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think there was like two groups of individuals that were like, responded to that story either privately or publicly to us. One group was saying, I can't believe Patty Cosgrave said that stuff to you guys while you were reporting. And then everyone else was either like, oh my God, that is a lot of money that they're asking for, or I can't believe we gave Collision that much anyways to be here. And then the subset of that group was like event organizers across Canada who are like, you're telling me that their venue gets subsidized? You know who I would want to kill to have my event venue subsidized in any format? But do you think that is like the biggest takeaway is just like,
I'm an old, right? So for me, if you look at Patty Cosgrave's Twitter, not about like
the other
conferences, just like look at his Twitter, like, you know, the kind of person that he is. I'm not saying one thing or another, but he's a polarizing kind of guy. He has opinions, he has a vision, and he does what he needs to do to make it happen. So I'm not saying it's good if what you reported is true and what the logic reported is true. That's not the nicest way to behave in the entire world, but I wasn't surprised. I didn't know what the sticker was, and I didn't know what the incremental sticker was. I didn't know that it was 10 million and now it's going to 40. Didn't know what that number was. I know that it's very hard to calculate that value. And I would argue we should talk to Phil about this. I would, unlike his point about saying, oh, well, get rid of that $40 million. What if you gave Phil $40 million? What if you gave all the conferences and you subsidized and allowed them to grow to the size that they wanted to be?
Various governments.
Yeah.
Give us $40 million.
But seriously, like it's not a small event, and whether it's efficacious for the startups or whether it's efficacious for the ecosystem, hard to know. Maybe it's hard to measure that exact thing, but is $40 million a deal or not? I don't know. If you gave each of these conferences $40 million, would they drive the same kind of impact that Collision wants to drive? I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if you can measure it, but it was nice to see those numbers out in the open, especially because it's our taxpayer dollars. And I think it did the right thing, which is engender a conversation about what does good look like? What should we be striving for as an ecosystem? And kudos to doing that, because this is the conversation we should be having.
Okay. Well, thank you for the kudos on our own podcast.
I didn't write it.
Rob nods solemnly to Douglas.
That's
Douglas
what it says here.
Over. Yeah. Okay. I'm just going through the script. Okay. No, I think that's well taken, because you're reminding me of something, and this is probably the best point for you to start jumping in, because I want to make sure that we're having an informed conversation here, and our tax subsidized dollars at work is the high level bumper sticker component. And I think we can go one level deeper here. We definitely have the reporting to hang our hats on that. But there was something that Rob said that stood out, and that was an earnest question of like what your reaction was. Because when we were talking about this with the editor on the story, Jenna Buck, who is new to the BetaKit team, more familiar with GA reporting across a variety of lens than say like our particular brand of tech reporting. One of the things that we talked about a lot was like, this started as a typical BetaKit tech reporting story. Like, hey, an event might be coming back, and seemed to scale up way higher to touch upon the municipal component, the economic impact component, I don't know, just like the national discourse somehow. But that's not where this started, right? Like talk us through the initial prompt for our interest into whether or not Collision was going to return.
And how the hell did you get John Tory to talk to you? As an addendum.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as I remember it, and a lot's happened since then.
In the heady days of April 2023.
A lot's happened since then. This was, now over a month ago. We initially got a tip that Patty had been communicating to members of the local tech community that Collision was set to return in 2024. So it initially, at least as I understood it and envisioned it, it was initially just going to be a story about Collision returning, because it seemed like the way he had been speaking to other people, which we
quick little like, hey, people are telling this, great. BetaKit was actually the first publication to report that Collision was coming to Canada initially in 2018. Like another little like, we've got this little feather in Josh's imaginary cap. I would lend him my cap feathers. I I guess then what happened when you tried to kind of confirm this or get comment?
Yeah. So as I understood it initially, based on what we'd heard from sources, is there was no issue. They were coming back. We reached out to a few other sources just to confirm this directly in case Collision was at the point that they didn't want to talk about this publicly.
Yep.
Because the way it's worked previously is they usually announce their return either just before or at opening day of or whatever city they'll be in next.
Oh, right.
At
Lisbon,
at the first day of each conference.
You don't want to roll up to the event wondering if that event's going to exist in that city next year, kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's just good.
Yeah, where they'll be or where they're going, and so reached out to a few people, confirmed that, then reached out to Patty, and just got a quick nothing has been agreed. Sorry. Response from him,
which the city also said as well.
Which
right?
the city also said there had been no deal signed yet.
It's also like weird because of COVID, that kind of fucked with the timing, didn't it? Because we had a 3-year deal.
Yes, we are beyond the initial 3 year.
And because of COVID, we got a extension collectively. I think they must have agreed at some point.
Yes.
Extend.
So basically, the way I understand it from my reporting is there was the deal that first come here in 2019, 3-year deal. They come here. COVID,
2019, 2020, 2021.
COVID hits.
Before COVID.
COVID hits.
Yeah.
They couldn't host the 2020 or 2021 events in person, and so there was an agreement signed to basically extend that initial deal by 2 years, and then this year being the last.
Yes, this is being the third year of the initial 3-year plan.
Yeah. But and then the interesting thing was after speaking to those sources who said, "Oh no, this was communicated. It was a sure thing based on what Patty had said to other people." My next question to him, I forget exactly how I phrased it, but my story outlines this was, "Why are you publicly communicating to people that this event will be back next year if no agreement's been signed?"
Or maybe let's say externally communicating, because I think these were at kind of like
that's a fair characterization.
But definitely telling non-Collision Web Summit city employees that this is happening.
Essentially.
Patty then responded to that question saying some things that we'll get to, trust me. But this kind of not denial, I think maybe confirmation that there was no confirmation then prompted us to have a bigger conversation about like, well, okay, then what is the circumstance here? Because if a deal isn't done, Collision's biggest advocate historically, former Toronto Mayor John Tory, the person who was doing those delegations to bring Collision here, who was attending delegations after it was locked in at Web Summit to see what it would be like, who was taking, as he told us in 2018, nothing for granted about this relationship, was no longer in office. So you have this period of uncertainty as it relates to the status of this event going forward, when you know they like to, again, set up future years in advance, and no leadership at the municipal level, specifically because our mayoral election doesn't happen until the 26th, but also no leadership there that had backed this event in the way years past, right? So we were looking at a gap and asking the question, how is that gap going to get filled?
Yeah, it's essentially, yeah, with basically with Mayor Tory out of office and Mayor Tory having been historically like the city's biggest, staunchest political advocate for this event, with him out of office, like, and the uncertainty of the status of Collision beyond this year, we sort of decided to dive into that from a municipal angle. And then I think at that point we thought maybe the story would be what Mayor Tory's departure might even sort of mean for other Toronto tech events, given that he'd been such a tech friendly mayor and such a big supporter of the community.
So we're talking about Elevate, which is another Toronto-based, kind of like nationally focused tech festival, but even more local events, whether it's like the Tech Toronto group of like, I would say like not quite meetup, but like that local kind of like pizza and beer, community-driven focus events, stuff like that had a close relationship with Mayor Tory. I think they'd actually even done a couple of tech TOs in City Hall, which is kind of a cool thing. But, you know, I teased it up at the top, but there's also that other component. Like, it's not just that the mayoral advocate's gone, that their budget's gone too, right? Because our city's broke.
Yeah, that the city had a sort of budget shortfall. I'd heard from sources that kind of the city's at a point. The city obviously has an interim mayor right now, but given the budget situation and the leadership situation, that there's sort of a hesitance to deploy a lot of cash for certain initiatives, and maybe even an ability to at least with, I think it's like around $1 billion budget shortfall they have this year. So certainly some interesting factors there that we sort of began to dive into at that point.
Okay. Before we get to the dollar ask, can you walk through, because so that this context then just sent, I was just like, Josh, this is the only thing you're working on until the story is written. You are not allowed to leave this hole. We'll feed you twice a day. You'll check in with Jenna, your editor. Puts the lotion in the bucket. I think before we get to the components of the story that you were able to report out in greater detail than I think any other publication has ever reported, to the point of where this hitting upon that provincial national interest is because we've got numbers that heretofore hadn't been kind of publicly known or seen. Let's talk about Mayor Tory, the advocacy, because it was actually, we didn't chase him down. We just sent an email and he got back to us, I think within like 2 hours, very eager to talk about this, saying that, I think it was something like, you might have heard, I've not been super public right now, but I'm going to make an exception to this because I believe that collision is so important. And that's tied into the economic impact that people within the city and the surrounding municipalities seem to feel collision provides. Can you go into a little bit of detail of like what that scale is, like why there are so many mayors, other business groups advocating for collision to remain, and like, I guess what the numbers are behind that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I have to avoid diving in too much detail. I have the high.
Yeah, he wrote 4,000 words, people. If you want to like read it, you can read it. But like, give people
I also break it down a bit more by year, but obviously this is a major North American tech conference. 35,000 or so people it hosted last year over just 3 days. So over a really tight period as well. Draws a lot of it serves as like, and I'm pulling this a bit from obviously my understanding, and then some of the reporting on what local advocates have mentioned in their letters advocating for this, but
of which we were able to obtain.
But this is a major tech event, serves as a means of showcasing Toronto and Canada's innovation ecosystem, serves as a means of connecting Canadian tech companies with tech companies from around the world, with investors in Canada and around the world. There's beyond just, different from some other events, beyond just the sort of direct spending of all these attendees coming down. This really an event that facilitates like a lot of business growth and sort of investment within the ecosystem, and draws a lot of people here that wouldn't be here otherwise to invest in companies and partnerships with companies. This is in terms of like Canadian tech events, this is probably safe to say it's the largest in terms of economic impact.
Yeah. So what are those numbers in terms of number of attendees and things like that?
So yeah, the numbers, what I have is from Destination Toronto, and they claim that, and this is including the 2023 event, the one that's set to take place in June. But over the course of its 2019 to 2023 stay, and remember, this is only 3 years because 2 years it was held online. Collision will fuel a total of $119 million in direct spending and $188 million in economic impact. And then Destination Toronto also emphasized that like in terms of an event like this, as I described, like it's tough to at least account for or calculate just the economic impact beyond that in terms of just other types of direct investments in companies, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So
it's worth noting the Destination Toronto, if you've never heard of that organization before, don't blame you.
Yep.
They're actually the organization responsible for like putting in the bid with collision, right? So when we talk about the city of Toronto, sometimes we're actually talking about Destination Toronto as the kind of tip of the spear for some of that stuff.
Same pockets.
Yeah.
It's just different pocket in the same pants.
Yeah. The giant GTA pants that we're all
different, in that it's not all coming directly out of the city budget. My understanding is a small portion of that is, but they're negotiating on behalf of the city and to promote tourism.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now,
in the region.
You made a really good point that this is not only one of the probably the largest tech event in Canada, one of the largest in North America, but it seemed like the people that we were speaking to, either off the record or what we were being supplied in terms of private support letters that were being sent advocating for collision to come back was this idea that it wasn't just like, because this is still smaller than TIFF, it's smaller than Pride, like by people and dollars, but they considered this to be more impactful because it wasn't attracting the broader local or Canadian audience to Toronto. It was bringing in international dollars. So like dollars that wouldn't normally come here. It was like a net new addition, which really stood out. I think maybe, do we want to, before we get to the bid, talk a little bit about the other events and how they're feeling about that? Or should we kind of go through what Destination Toronto was willing to give Collision to come here and maybe what the ask was on the table for them to stay? And then we can get into the response to that.
Maybe the latter, because that contextualizes the other conferences.
So understanding the economic impact,
excuse me,
what was Destination Toronto through Proxy in the City and everyone else giving Collision for that first 3-year agreement, the 3-year, 5-year? And then what's on the table for the go forward?
Right. Okay. Yeah. Happy to explain that. So at least in terms of their initial 3-year deal, the one that was extended, Collision's currently receiving around 6.5 million Canadian annually. And this is from Toronto and its partners as part of a deal that's funded largely by Destination Toronto. This includes, I know, at least $750K annually from the city, which comes out of their budget from, I think, their economic development budget. So that's what they're currently receiving.
And that's not all pure funds, right? A lot of that is like the subsidies that we were talking about. So like covering the Intercare Center, covering the Wi-Fi. Like Collision isn't paying for that stuff to happen.
Yeah, my understanding is it's not. So there's a small portion of that is cash, and a lot of that is in kind and subsidizing some of the stuff like the use of the Intercare Center in Toronto. So that sort of thing.
Okay.
So that's the current deal. That obviously concluding this year, 2023 at the June event. In terms of negotiations to stay in Toronto, my understanding is Collision sought a deal worth an amount similar to what Web Summit gets or is now getting from the Portuguese government to host its event in Lisbon. And that's around 11 million euros per year, which currency conversion is about 16 million Canadian.
Yeah.
That's at least what we know they were seeking at one point.
Yeah. Let's say we know more, and then that framing and phrasing is not feature complete, but accurate. And that's where that.
So it's close to double, not quite double per year.
At one point, they were seeking more than double.
Fluctuates.
At one point, more than double
but
per year.
The point is, it's not an increment. It's not like instead of 6.5 per year, it's 7.
Yeah, it's a pretty significant jump.
Increase. And is that all cash? Because the cost of the Intercare Center is the cost of the Intercare Center. The cost of Wi-Fi is the cost of Wi-Fi. Did you get a sense of that or no?
My understanding is it would be a mix of that.
Yeah, but I think
probably resembling the initial deal, but maybe with some more cash involved.
Okay.
I don't have all the details there and can't report all the details I have.
Yeah, I would say we can't. I would say that's what we're comfortable reporting. But I think the takeaway from this, I think in terms of public reaction, is that 16 million times 3, north of $40 million. I think that's what's really stuck in people's brains, which is why it's so important for us to know that this isn't just like a giant Brinks truck backed up, but it is certain subsidies and offsets, which is different consideration. But when it comes to, whether it's other event organizers locally around the country, or like, let's talk about Phil Telio, that is whether they give you the money to pay for it, or they cover the cost of things that you as an event organizer need to pay for.
It's money.
It's that, right? So Phil says, essentially, our government effectively paid the foreign-owned Collision to come here and compete against us. The lesson we're teaching Canadian entrepreneurs is simple. You can't be world-class, and your governments will literally pay foreign companies to compete against you. Mm-hmm. Obviously, this is like, we love Startup Fest. Phil is a very solid guy. Who has been building something locally here in Canada for many years, fighting his own battles through COVID and otherwise. So there's got to be, like, Rob, if I found out that you were launching a side podcast and you had received millions of dollars in subsidies to make that happen, I would definitely take out an op-ed in the Globe and Mail. But I
And they'd
think
be like, who?
yeah, and this people be like, they paid for this? Man, the Globe and Mail is really going down. But no, this is, I think, is also an opportunity for Startup Fest at the national stage to capture some of the conversation around this and use it to promote their event, which happens to be taking place like more or less 2 to 3 weeks after Collision.
They've been moving closer.
Yes,
in time.
there will be
there's a long weekend in the middle.
There's going to be a singularity point where
exactly.
it's Collision Startup Fest, Startup Collision, I guess we should call it. Someone purchased that domain and then sent it to us. So there is a bit of self-marketing here, and I could do nothing but slow golf clap the Globe's opinion editor for having the brains to go to Phil Tellio at a Startup Fest and say, hey, do you want to write something, when we could have easily have done that. But this response speaks to, I think, 2 ideas here. One, events across Canada, and I think around the world because of the COVID pandemic, have been struggling, which is why so many events in Toronto, for however they might vote on the Democratic spectrum, were very sad to learn that Mayor Tory was stepping down, because he had been a vocal advocate and supporter for events and activities. That's been a very different scenario in Quebec for Startup Fest, or in Ottawa for SAS North, or in Vancouver for Innovate West,
Calgary.
or Traction, which was like Vancouver Startup Week is taking place where we're recording right now, entirely like volunteer organized. They have not received this level of attention from their local, municipal, provincial, federal governments. I guess maybe Rob, I'll turn to you here again. Like this is this fair criticism? Is this a bunch of kind of like Canadians being like, oh, we want to be the big thing, but we're not the big thing, and we're upset when the big thing comes? Like,
it's a great question. Big isn't always necessarily good. It's not necessarily bad either. Startup Fest, full disclosure, we're doing a live podcast. We said that, but we're doing a live podcast at
we will do a live
Startup Fest.
podcast wherever you will let us do a live podcast.
We did one at SAS North.
Yeah.
We did one in your bathroom one time.
Yep. Great acoustics.
That's true. Kind of shitty acoustic. Get it? Okay. Anyway.
No, come on.
So it's tricky because on the one hand, it's like, it feels very Canadian to Phil's point, which is like, ooh, thing that's not successful in Canada, you should bring to Canada. Now it's successful. Right? It's a very Canadian thing to find something.
Very happy to get.
We
some
get
international
validated
attention.
when we get something that's not ours.
Let's get the Prime Minister on stage. We'll get the Canada flag socks going.
Right.
Rah, rah, Canada.
And with startups, same thing, right? I don't know if I want to invest in this or use them as a customer, so they get some validation in the States. Now Canadians are interested in working with them or investing in them because it's a pattern as old as time.
We
in
just
Canada
did
land.
hour plus long health tech conversation with 2 health tech CEOs being like, procurement is broken in this country.
Right.
Which is why people go to the US or look to these US companies. That's not a tech, like technology
No.
thing. It's across the
Unfortunately,
spectrum.
it's a Canadian thing, but that's true. On the other hand, I think we can think big too, going back to the previous point, which is, okay, we can subsidize a big conference to come here. This is the thing that I don't get, is that all countries around the world, all cities, all states, all countries, they put their fingers on the scale of business or things that they think will lead to their competitive advantage. If they want to subsidize, just like the Americans subsidize corn so that it makes sense to farm corn, but it might not make sense if it wasn't subsidized. We pick, as a society, we pick where we want to spend our money, and we pick what we want to favor, and we pick where we want to succeed. We had Scale AI on, and they said, look, we can't do all of AI. We can't have Canada being a leader in AI. We're going to pick supply chain. That is where Canada will be a leader in AI. And I think we can do the same with conferences. We can say, hey, hold on a second. Attracting the rest of the planet to Canada to build and to share is something that matters to us as Canadians. And so I'm not saying $40 is a good deal or a bad deal. If it's true, $40 million. It's $40?
$40 would be a
$40
slight difference.
great deal.
Slight difference.
I meant 40 euros, which is 40 million Canadian. So if you put in 40 million and you get 120 out, that's okay. And what is that a good number? I don't actually know. I'm not a person who manages these kinds of budgets, but I think we can, as a society, think bigger. And if these conferences, we lean into these conferences and we think that is a way collectively to drive innovation in this country and to drive interest in what's going on, then Yeah, let's continue that thing. Don't say it's an either or thing. This is not a zero-sum game. It's not like $40 million is $40 billion.
No,
it's not superclusters.
I agree. It's a great point. I do think, like, just noting off the top, there is that kind of component where, and I'm glad you noted it, because I felt this even when collision, like the change from, hey, Toronto might get collision, Canada might get collision, this is really big for us, to the minute it was announced, like, I'm not sure what value collision has for me and my star. Like the instant, and
yes.
It's
we're
like
cool.
Toronto energy is like, do we really, like, we want the thing to come, and then it shows up. This global thing shows up beside us in our city, and then maybe we don't feel like we're get to participate in it as much as we want, or we don't get, it's not Canadians on stage at Collision being celebrated. It's Collision coming to Canada, and that should be the celebration. And I think that's, our ecosystem has had a really hard time reconciling it. The other side, you're saying, whether it's 40 million or anything, we did a hour-long, been doing a lot of longer pods lately, AMA with Ben Bergen of CCI, talking about the government not having a cohesive innovation policy or strategy because they keep doing these kind of like individual singular tactical job commitments, whether it's like a deal with Volkswagen or somebody else that are big and splashy. We just did locally in Canada, the Abcelera commitment, like $700 million for biotech. 300 million being committed by the feds in the province. The 7 million is the all-in number. I should be careful about that. But this idea that, like, hey, all of these one-off things are great and they bring a thing, but they're to Phil's point, there isn't a secondary kiddie pool of money for local event, grassroots innovation stuff here. So like failing to have that makes it seem like a zero-sum binary.
Absolutely.
Like, does that resonate?
Yeah, and also, like, to your point in the story, it's Toronto and Toronto GTA. I mean, part of the problem here is that
I love that you said Toronto and then Toronto GTA, which speaks to a cultural dynamic that we'll get to for non-Toronto. Like, is it Toronto?
Well,
is it Toronto?
But Destination Toronto is not the city, the downtown core of Toronto. It's a broader thing. So it's like, and I think part of the consternation, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least from the people I speak to in the city, part of the consternation is that it's like, well, hold on a second. If we're adding a value to the province and the country, should they put in any money? Like, of that $100 million, is that economic development just for the GTA, or is there some actual benefit beyond the Toronto thing? So the challenge, the other thing that we need to get over as a country is the sort of regionality thing, where it's like, we are a country of 33, 35 million people. We're not very big. We're basically New York City in terms of population or whatever it is. So it's like this regional, we're very spread out.
Billion New York cities in geography.
It doesn't really matter where other than that spread, it doesn't really matter where Canadian innovation happens. And if we're investing in a regional capacity, there's nothing wrong with highlighting those regions, but if we're investing in a regional way and don't have a strategy about what the hell we're doing, we're reliant on those pockets that happen to be able to convince those other pockets.
Fend for themselves.
Right? Like, if Vancouver actually gets collision, if they get collision, it's going to be on something like the terms that you probably have described. And what's going to happen in 3 years? The same conversation. The price is going to go up.
Yes.
And then are we going to fight each other within Canada to...
My friends, let's cut to the chase. You're a founder, an entrepreneur, you're hungry, you're fast, you're agile, and you need a legal eagle that matches your pace. The answer? This episode's sponsor, Good Lawyer. Now, this isn't your grandpa's law firm. Good Lawyer is the trusted legal partner of thousands of businesses nationwide, boasting fixed-fee legal projects and their revolutionary fractional general counsel. And look, I'm no lawyer. I can't tell you what tort law means, only that it sounds delicious. But when BetaKit found itself in a labyrinth of legalities, Good Lawyer stepped in, delivering results that were as efficient as they were cost-effective. Plus, Good Lawyer's fractional general counsel isn't just versed in the law, they become versed in your business. They stand in the trenches with you, offering practical legal advice that fuels your momentum. So visit goodlawyer.ca today to see for yourself and tell them that BetaKit sent you.
is a perfect segue to the Vancouver component of this. And
Okay.
I agree with your framing. I'll say, when we're talking about this, it's much easier for Web Summit in Lisbon or whether it's in Rio to do that, because those are countries where there's a greater unity between municipal, provincial if they have it, and federal governments.
Yeah.
We're dealing with a country here where there's Toronto might see this as a great win for Canada, and everyone outside of Toronto is like, fuck you guys.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Vancouver, because Josh, you reported this story. Well, before we get to the story, let's talk about who was publicly saying out loud, hey, wouldn't it be cool if Toronto isn't it, maybe Vancouver is it? We're the true Silicon Valley North. Who are these people making public statements? Just pondering if there was a chance, a hope that Collision might come to Vancouver.
Yeah. So following the publication of our initial Collision story, at least, and at least the news, it being broadly known that Collision was exploring other opportunities and potentially some other bids from other cities, most outside of Canada. There were a few public posts from some folks connected with Frontier Collective, which is a Vancouver-based sort of a relatively new Vancouver-based innovation ecosystem advocacy group, kind of focused on, in particular, promoting Vancouver and certain sort of emerging sectors for Vancouver, like AR, VR, Web3, and some other stuff like that. But there were two specific posts, one from the editor-in-chief of the Daily Hive, Carm Sanal. He wrote an op-ed in the Daily Hive calling for Vancouver to explore a potential bid for Collision, saying it was an opportunity that they couldn't afford to miss. And then the significance there being that Daily Hive is one of the founding partners of Frontier Collective.
Yeah, you kind of. I was trying to tease it in a cool way, but then you spoiled the ending. So Carm Sumal, CEO of Daily Hive, is a member of Frontier Collective. The CEO of Frontier Collective?
Frontier Collective's co-founder and COO. Cassandra Linklater posted on LinkedIn asking whether Collision could be Vancouver's North by Northwest.
Okay.
So does that make it North by Northeast if it's
No, it's still
in
North by
Toronto?
Northwest.
I'm just kidding.
Oh, well,
I'm
in
just being-
Vancouver, it'd
No,
be
I'm just
North by
being stupid. I'm
Northwest.
being
North by
stupid.
Northeast is a great music festival that I used to. But
Not funny.
what is funny here is that despite all this public questioning, Josh, your story reported, what is this group of individuals considering making an actual formal bid for Collision to be in Vancouver?
So following some conversations with some folks, including at Frontier Collective, and then some folks at the Vancouver Economic Commission, which is also founding partner of Frontier Collective, as is Vancouver's like equivalent of Destination Toronto.
Destination Vancouver.
You wouldn't guess their name. Following some conversations with those folks, it became clear that that behind the scenes, some people are exploring the possibility of putting together
Those same people. The call is coming from inside the house. The people who are publicly saying, man, wouldn't it be, could it happen here? Could it be us? Are the same people working with, and as we should know, the mayor of Vancouver will be speaking at Collision. The Frontier Collective hosts a Vancouver takeover night at Collision. One of the organizers for Rise, which is like Web Summit's Asian component, is a member of the Frontier Collective, and I believe has lived in Vancouver. The call is coming from inside the house, and they're calling everybody to say, can we make this happen? Now, what is the viability of Vancouver being an alternative hosting destination for this? Because this isn't the first time that Vancouver has come up as a potential candidate, right? Like they were exploring this initially for the 2019 arrival of Collision.
Yeah. So back when Collision was still taking place in New Orleans, Vancouver, alongside Toronto, was exploring the possibility of putting together a bid and trying to lure Collision to Canada. I've spoken with a bunch of people about this, and some say, at least in terms of the initial exploration, it was determined that Vancouver didn't quite have the hotel capacity and convention center capacity to really host an event the size of Collision and with the growth ambitions of Collision, because Collision's grown a fair bit every year since then. So that was sort of what determination was made back then. Obviously, Toronto won out, 3-year deal, turned into 5.
And now looking likely that there's going to be, as we reported initially,
yeah,
pretty close to at least a 1-year bridge. Like,
sounds like there's going to, and I should say on that front, sounds like there's going to be, at least at this point, that they're very close to a 1-year bridge at very close to the initial deal, which was around
6.5 million.
Around 6.5 million. But so those conversations, those are what the conversations were initially. Now I've heard from some people that that's still the case. Vancouver does host some really large events right now. I think the TED conference is one. I think there's a big Alcoholics Anonymous conference or get together as well.
Yeah. I think the difference being though that like Toronto can host multiple events at the same time, and if Vancouver were to get Collision,
That's the one.
it would need to be at the point where nothing else is going on. So like, hey, Traction, I really miss you guys this year. I had a great time last year. Vancouver in August, impeccable. My partner is from Vancouver. Vancouver in February, not it for a North American international attendance. And I think that's part of what put a bullet in at least the initial scoping of this.
Yeah, and I should say that what I've heard is at least in order for that to happen, there need to be some maneuvering around the other events, particularly in the summer months, for something like that to happen. Other people I've spoken to say that's possible and doable. Other people say that it'd only really be possible if maybe they hosted a smaller event in exchange for more money. There would sort of need to be.
It's not gonna happen.
Whether that's feasible, who knows?
Yeah.
But some folks say it's possible, including folks at Frontier Collective and the Vancouver Economic Commission. But there need to be some maneuvering in order for something like this to happen.
And I think some people are saying, do we even really need to consider this now that Cube Media has announced Innovate West, right? Which will be a similar
$39 million.
Yeah, $39 million.
The low price.
No, but again, we've now got Elevate, Startup Fest, C2, Innovate West. Inventures just happened
in Calgary. Yeah,
we'll be talking about that in a future episode soon. Like we've now got a spectrum of locally grown events across the country, but they're, I think Rob, to what you were saying before, there is no one event to rule them all because it's easier to get a flight to Paris than it is from Vancouver to Toronto,
and
like
cheaper.
easier and cheaper. Yeah. That isn't the case. And I feel like I don't think anyone from Vancouver, like if Collision is your Canadian event that you're going to, you don't host a Vancouver takeover at that event because you see it as a Canadian event. You host a Vancouver takeover at the event because you see it as a Toronto event and you want presence there, right? So I hear what you're saying before, but I think some of this we have to note that while there's been national attention and international attention on Collision being here, because outside the world, they're just like, yeah, Canada, that's that place, right? The poutine and the hockey and the whatnot. Here, this is still following along those traditional lines of city-states vying with each other to be the most loved child in the succession drama that is our national discourse. Let's get to the weird stuff. So we've just had a conversation about the state of tech events in Canada, who's vying for what, who's rising in the power rankings, who's falling in the power rankings. Again, RIP Traction, we hope you come back. CIX, TBD will remain to be seen how long that's viable for. Now we got to talk about the inside baseball stuff. Josh, when you went to Patty as the follow-up saying, hey, we know you said there's nothing to announce. We have multiple people, I think like at least 4, I can't remember the number we know in our story, who have told us directly that you said yes, that it's coming back at ostensibly this 1-year bridge at the very least. What did Patty then say to you in response? I don't qualify that as saying over email. This was an email exchange.
Sure, yeah. So I have it up here. And basically, so I asked this follow-up question, told him what, like basically presented him with what I'd heard and asked why he was saying otherwise. And he responded with, and I quote, don't you guys take cash in return for quotation marks stories? If you're followed that up with, I think in the same email, if you're doing some sort of fishing for cash, we're not interested. And then in a subsequent follow-up email shortly thereafter, he added, wait, that is you guys. You are total scumbag, quotation marks, journalists, ... creeps. And so that was a little jarring to get on the evening before we were planning on running.
Yeah, just hey, Collision's coming back to Toronto.
Collision story.
Yeah.
Certainly the only time I've ever heard anything like that from a source at all, let alone to a simple query or a simple follow-up query.
Yeah. So, and then I think we should note that after you went away in a bunker for a month to report out the rest of the story, we gave Patty one final opportunity to say, hey, you said some weird stuff to us that we don't understand. You know, you can read our story, but I'll say we don't take money for stories. I could make jokes about what my wardrobe might look like if we did, or things like that. But like it's, we didn't even understand where Patty was coming from because the accusations were so left field from our experience, our mission, everything like that. But we did give him one more opportunity. He said that he kind of stood by his original statement.
Yeah, he basically, we gave him the chance to clarify these comments and add anything he'd like. And he just noted, I don't engage with dishonest journalists.
Oh, yes.
That was the quote. And then, declined to say anything else beyond that. And so given the nature
Which
of those.
Which is weird that we're now going to be on center stage of Collision in a couple of weeks talking about this stuff, right? Let's, privately in response to Patty, I sent an email saying it's inappropriate for you to be speaking to any of our writers that way when they're reporting their story. And hey, can we talk about this? Because I don't understand where you're coming from. Maybe like, is there another BetaKit that you might be thinking of? Does BetaKit mean something different in Gaelic? Maybe you've just got the translation wrong. Like we're a different publication. Didn't hear back. I think this is probably, I'm not gonna. Maybe actually, let me just ask you this: how did you feel about that? How did you feel about receiving that, or just other than the surprise?
A little surprised, a little shocked. Initially hesitant that this was back when the Leafs were in the playoffs, so I was heading to a better days. You were focused on
I
was in
things.
Maple Leaf Square looking at my phone thinking, what the fuck? No, it was just surprised, taken aback. I guess on some level, part of me thought, okay, like there's got to be even more to this now. And that's part of the impetus, I think, for us as to why we really began pursuing this on multiple levels.
Our story also notes that we heard from sources that many sponsors locally communicated that if Collision wasn't coming back for multiple years, they were less inclined to sponsor this year because at that major sponsorship level, you want to feel like you're building something over a period of time, which might, again, this is just pure speculation, but point to a motivation why you communicate that things are happening before the deal is done because you want to create that confidence. So that's I think a standard kind of startup thing. You sell through and then you look to deliver after the fact. So I asked you that question because I wanted to give you the opportunity to speak to it. I'm now going to transition. I'm going to turn, and then Robert and I are going to talk about the logic component of this and then wrap up this conversation because I think we've gone through the stuff that we really want to talk to you. Now there's the stuff that we have to mention. Otherwise we're not doing.
By the way, the context was useful because reading the story, I was like, is there something missing in this? Because it felt like a bit of a non sequitur in the story, and it's not a non sequitur. That's how it happened, which is interesting.
Yes, which let's say we felt an obligation to include that information in the story because for two reasons. I think as you just really definitely note in the story, if this is a government supported event fueled in some part by public subsidy or money, people should know what's going on with the people receiving that. But then also we had a strong opinion that if this was the private communication, that once we ran this story, there would be more public conversation, and it would have been maybe unfair to our readers to articulate this stuff after the fact than right up front. We just wanted to kind of lay it all out.
I see.
let's go now to the logic side of this, which starts with an op-ed that David Scott published this past Saturday at the time of recording, basically saying that they had been barred from participating in Collision because in the 26th, which is, again, busy day for Toronto, the Logic is hosting their own subscriber only summit, and they had been effectively told that they would not. Let me pull it up specifically. I'm gonna use David's words here rather than paraphrase, because the parsing of this gets a little unique. He was told specifically that Collision won't be having anyone from the Logic speak at this or any future web summit or Collision events, and that they were not allowed to receive media accreditation to cover this year's Collision. So not only like, hey, we can't have you speaking on stage at Collision this year, you can't come and cover this event, which, as David makes the argument, for a publicly subsidized event is a really weird look to bar local media from covering your events. But then also in light of our reporting and the way that we were kind of communicated to, just kind of reporting out a very interesting story, it might have pointed to something else going on, and allusions were made to like freedom of the press and stuff like that. As we noted, there was a pretty full-throated denial from Collision on that front, and they just said this is just an instance of piggybacking. They're totally free to attend. They just can't speak at both. And then later that day, late yesterday afternoon, that's when the tweet I originally we cordially invite all of these organizations to speak on stage, and the Logic, anyone from the Logic who wants to show up, friends, family, you get accreditation. That was all fine now by end of day. I think the thing that our audience needs to know happened between the time periods of the Logic publishing this letter from the editor to Patty's second statement on the matter was that a number of other Canadian journalists, a bunch of North American publications became aware of this and thought that barring media from covering your event for reasons not related to that is a bad look, and started to communicate either disinterest or directly an unwillingness to participate in Collision this year, if that were to be the case. And I'm not going to name any of these publications. I'm not going to name any of these individuals. I was privy, obviously, I think this op-ed went up at like early Saturday morning. I woke up to a variety of messages and phone calls, and that conversation has continued until late into last evening when Collision kind of made an about face or looked to kiss and make up with everyone that they had accused of various things. But it is my strong belief that whatever misconceptions aside, and I'm not saying, I'm not taking on faith specifically everything the Logic said went down as it did. I'm not taking on faith everything Collision said went down. It seemed like there was just some sort of disconnect between, we're not trying to stop you from doing this, we're only trying to stop you from doing this. Like, it just seemed like there was some misunderstanding there. This change has happened specifically because I believe personally that other journalists, other publications across North America, when engaging with Collision since this op-ed came out, said this isn't going to fly. And we are less interested in participating in Collision going forward. And I think that is all of this extracurricular stuff, whether it's the dollar amount, the subsidies, the Toronto versus Vancouver versus Montreal component, have led people to message me that they're kind of like at the point where they're kind of tired of Collision. And they think things will be simpler and easier if and when they're gone. I'm not going to parse into that too much other than to say it is very interesting that we're now in a position where there's a public open invitation for BetaKit, the Logic, and Startup Fest to speak on stage. I have indicated that I am interested in doing that, or at least willing, let's say. I think Phil from Startup Fest has communicated they're not interested, and I haven't seen anything from David or the Logic yet. I think they're looking to consider it. It's been a whirlwind couple days. I will note that we talked in our conversation with Jonathan Goldsby recently about the death of certain media publications, that it didn't seem clear to the general public the amount of work that journalists put in to report what they report. I think from our first tip to the day that Josh filed his initial story was like a full month to the day. Obviously, this has been an ongoing issue surrounding our work. I want to say that explicitly because we put a lot of care and consideration into what we publish. And I think I'm willing to speak on stage to ask Patty some of the questions in person that heretofore he's been unable or unwilling to really answer over email or otherwise. But Rob, I want to go back to that idea of maybe like, because this whole conversation didn't need this extra sauce on it, right? How do you parse the mess that we're now in, where Collision felt that at some point they have to extend courtesy hands publicly, whether in good faith or otherwise, to 3 organizations that, 2 of them media organizations, 2 of them event organizations, have a bit of friction with North America's biggest tech festival.
I think it's anyone who's starting or running any kind of business, it's just hard. And so you're always taking flack from all directions, and getting up and facing that flack is really difficult. And I often try to look at incompetence over malice when I ascribe behaviors to people. I fucked up, I didn't know, versus I'm actively trying to screw you over for some reason. Most of the time
that you were trying to screw me, and then I counter screwed, and then
So if you take it that way,
whole relationship with Sean Silkoff is basically like that. Hi, Sean.
Your movie was good.
Yeah.
So I think what's the net of this is exposing how the sausage is made and having the conversation about what matters to Canadians and what we want to be and how we want to present ourselves to the world and what's important to us and what's not important to us and where do we want to invest our time, money, effort. This is a good conversation to be having. It's an important conversation. It's unfortunate about the name calling and the bad blood and all that other stuff. But at the end of the day, I'm sure that actually getting Collision to Toronto, I don't know. I just assume that all of the stuff that had to happen to make that even happen was remarkably difficult. Remarkably difficult. Don't forget, it was in Vegas, then it went to New Orleans, then it came to Toronto. So it didn't just start in New Orleans. It's traveled around the States before coming here. And
this isn't the first will they, won't they kind of.
Right. And so I think that I'd sort of like to focus on how we can, when you're on stage and having those chats, which is like what matters to Collision and what do they want to do? Mm-hmm. What are they trying to do? Yes, they're trying to make money, but it's bigger than that. They have a mission beyond just money making. Yeah. What's the point of the media? I think these things are to expose this information, and perhaps there's a reason why the government didn't want to share how much they want to invest. But maybe it's a good thing that we know what the drivers of these things are, because it creates these other kinds of conversations.
We've heard from a lot of other journalists that like, good on you for getting this information because they had tried and those FOI requests were never honored, right?
Yeah.
So there's whether or not the intention behind keeping some of this information private, whether or not it should be part of the public conversation as we
and it now is, right? And that's great, because now we can look to other conferences and maybe now other ecosystems, like if in Quebec, maybe they're like, hold on a second, if they're spending that much on a conference, maybe we should give Startup Fest a break. Maybe not $40 million, but maybe $5 million. Maybe we give you some free space. Maybe we give you some free accommodations.
Give them a bigger island on Montreal to host.
Just dredge one up. Take some more expo space. Yeah. And so I think that's a good thing. And as long as we keep having that conversation and keep exposing those things, then we can have a conversation as a society about what matters. And that's how I sort of look at this whole arc. And I hope that this, as Obama said, it bends in the right direction. It bends to us being more open and aggressive about promoting Canada and bringing investors to Canada and bringing startups to Canada, bringing capital to Canada. That's really what this is all about. And let's not lose sight of that because of one conference.
Do you think what do you think is the current public perception of collision now, given all this? Because I've been asked the question quite a few times, and I have to think to myself, it's the case that the reaction to the kind of petty behavior towards the logic, or even the dollar figures, like or the behavior between Patty directly and BetaKit, I'll say that we've had no issues with the rest of Collision or their comms team in terms of engaging with us professionally, whether they, respond to our questions or like give us the answers that we're looking for. That's been completely above board. I kind of feel like we wouldn't be in this position right now with any of those individual things. It's like the combination of all three has kind of created a superstorm.
Mm-hmm.
What do you feel give me a vibe check. Give me a collision vibe check. Because we're too in it. Apparently I'm on center stage right now, having to have this conversation over again with Patty. It's so much easier to just come on the podcast, man. We did it in 2019.
Did he ever say he was coming on stage with you, or are you just going to be on stage?
There's no way in hell that you publicly invite 3 organizations and individuals and not be a part of that conversation. So Patty, I don't know who's moderating that, but if it happens, you're going to be on stage because I want to ask you the questions that I haven't been able to get answers from yet. And I think they would be expecting that.
I don't know if I can speak for everyone else, but my take on it is the sausage making is really gross. Things are hard. Sometimes, like, I'm not saying I'm not condoning behavior. I'm not condoning anything. I'm just saying that sausage making is pretty yucky. Yeah. And when you see how the sausage is made, sometimes you don't want to see how the sausage is made.
Josh, what sausage are you next unraveling on BetaKit? What's the next 4,000 word piece?
Remember, I enjoy sausage. I don't.
No, you just don't want to see it. Yeah.
To be determined. Yeah. Hopefully,
not even going to tease your editor on what he's working on. Okay,
hopefully, writing about maybe some just Canadian tech companies again.
Oh yeah,
rather than foreign tech events that are taking place here.
Yeah. It's okay.
Yeah, but TBD.
All right. It's probably worth noting here to your sausage point, Rob, which was perfect. BetaKit stopped hosting its own events in 2018, and there was because making the sausages
slaughtering those hogs, man.
Yeah, slaughtering.
It's just not good.
Okay, I think we got there. I think we covered everything in this document that we feel.
Can't wait to the episode next week. I wonder what's going to happen.
Next week we're just going to be talking about Apple VR.
Oh yeah,
it's just some old school.
You're
we're
assuming nothing's happening between now and then. Okay.
Oh yeah, we should note for everyone that we are recording this midweek, June 7th. I have no idea what's going to happen between now and then. Or even Collision, which is June 26th, which is a little too far away for me to feel comfortable that nothing's going to happen in the interim. But I think one thing that you can count on, whether it's on this podcast or on betakit.com or certainly on Twitter, you can count on us to keep you up to date on what's happening because the sausage is messy, but that's where we eat. So until next episode, I guess we'll see you at Collision.